Since time immemorial, natives have lived along the islands, peninsulas, and mainland shores of Puget Sound, now known as the Salish Sea. Long before European explorers and settlers, before roads or bridges, native villages and fishing camps were widely separated by open saltwater bays and straits. To hunt, fish, or trade along these shorelines and across the water, natives came to rely on and to perfect the making and handling of canoes.
We always called the Straits of Juan de Fuca, the Salish Sea, basically. We always call that our ancestral highways because that's how our people traveled when they had to get from place to place. Go to the hunting grounds, go to the fishing grounds, or go to a celebration.
European explorers dating back to the 1700s found a thriving canoe culture in place, first described in early journals, ship's logs, sketches, and paintings. Canoes along the Pacific Northwest coast were carved primarily from western red cedar logs, cut from enormous old-growth trees that were 500 to 800 years old, which are rare today. To construct a canoe, the builder first searched for the perfect tree. He looked for one with a straight trunk, uninterrupted by limbs, to determine the desired length of the hull, and conveniently located near salt water for ease of launching. A family canoe, 25 to 35 feet, was a typical length in our region, carrying 2 to 6 paddlers. Some of the early canoes stretched to more than 60 feet and were capable of carrying a small village, as well as several tons of cargo.
Family canoes we use to travel to the different destinations. They're a little bit wider, and the war canoes are a lot skinnier and sleeker. They can move faster, but the family canoes are used to travel, and they can weather a lot of waves and wind and whatever else.
The basic canoe form was carved with an elbow adze, a tool originally made by a shaped and sharpened stone blade lashed to the elbow or crotch of a tree branch. As the carver pulled the blade toward him, he shaved wood away from the log. Skillfully carved canoes have neat ridges left from the carving which add to the beauty. Later, when steel began to appear, originally sourced from shipwrecks, metal blades were used and cherished. What began as a simple dugout became increasingly sophisticated over time. Careful use of fire helped remove wood and open the hull's interior. For the larger family canoes, the final step used steam to widen and shape the hull. Rocks were heated in a fire and then dropped into water into the bottom of the canoe until it boiled and produced steam. A low fire was also kept around the outside of the hull. When steamed, the wood fibers become soft and expand and spread with the assistance of spreading sticks tapped into place between the gunnels, causing the sides to flare apart. The wood fibers on the outside of the canoe contract and shrink from the heat provided by the low fire. This helps encourage spreading and provides a waterproof finish on the outside of the hull. When the desired beam and form are reached, the water is removed and the canoe allowed to cool. The spreading process does more than simply widen the canoe. It also creates major form changes throughout the entire canoe hull, changes which have been anticipated by the canoe maker who chose and began carving the log. The straight and level gunnels would now bend smoothly out and down, while the ends rise to form a graceful shear and transform a rigidly narrow hollow trough into an elegant watercraft that handles well and tracks smoothly even in rough water. Large family and war canoes were often painted with designs illustrating the names of the canoes or the crests of the owners. Several types of canoes were made and used. The typical canoe form that many of us visualize when we talk of Northwest natives is the large family canoe, described by early European explorers and settlers. The family canoe is the largest of them, with graceful lines and a raised, very distinctive bow that resembles a dog's head. However, they were not designed to look like a dog.
No, my father-in-law explained this to me. So every canoe has a head. There's a head on the canoe. And they should also have a tail. So there's a tail on there, and that identifies, the front and back, of course.
but more efficiently cut through the waves and to reflect the image of a living thing. They were purposely designed and built to be ocean-worthy, with no frills, for maximum efficiency. These canoes were also used to haul freight. When a family moved to summer fishing areas, they tied 2 canoes together. Valuable planks from their houses served as a platform between the canoes, and along with other possessions, were loaded and moved to the summer campsite. Not all canoe styles were built in all villages. In this area, most of the family canoes were traded for with the Makah people from Nia Bay, or the Nootka people across the straits on Vancouver Island, both places where the necessary larger cedar trees could be found. On Penn Cove, canoes made by the lower Skagit people were typically smaller fishing canoes, skillfully crafted, double-ended, flat-bottomed canoes built to carry 1 or 2 people. Most families also had a family canoe for longer open-water excursions. The Upper Skagit people and other Northwest natives who lived on fresh water built and used shovel-nose canoes, which were designed for streams, rivers, and lakes. They were flat-bottomed for stability and a shallow draft, and they were rectangular like a large carved food tray. These canoes were poled by 1 or 2 people and were used for fishing in the shallow streams. This canoe would not work well in salt water, where it would be at the mercy of ocean waves and rough chop. Early explorers noted that cattail mats were used to create square-rigged sails for canoes. We don't know if this innovation was developed by observing the sailing vessels of lost mariners, possibly from China or Japan, or if this was their own creation. Native peoples traversing Puget Sound in their well-built cedar canoes provided an essential ferry service for arriving European American settlers as early as the 1840s. With the founding and settling of cities like Olympia and Seattle, the most basic roads and bridges still decades in the future, the many waterways, inlets, and bays of the Salish Sea formed a water highway route for much of the western part of Washington. By the 1850s, what began as simple canoe travel had become a ragtag fleet of steam vessels known as the Mosquito Fleet, plying more than 40 different routes across the lower Puget Sound. As steamboats took over from paddled canoes, many of the traditional large canoes fell out of use and sat idle. Like the great sailing barks and schooners in their time, they were no longer useful. And with coastal raiding and the great battles behind them, design and production of canoes began to change. They became smaller, lighter, fleeter, and instead of settling disputes with other native groups and communities, racing and competition became the challenge. Canoe racing throughout the Salish Sea, with its pride, skill, and demands of physical excellence, became the modern focus. For a time, the tribal canoe culture languished, eclipsed by living with treaties, world wars, the Great Depression, and other more demanding aspects of life in the 20th century. Still, there were signs of vitality and interest in keeping canoe culture alive and well. In 1930, the first Penn Cove Water Festival featured the native war canoe races, the first many non-natives, even local people, had ever seen. And for 12 years, until the beginning of World War II, the tribal canoe races continued. This popular event was resurrected in 1992 and has grown from a tourism-based event into a cross-cultural celebration. Because of its cultural significance and tradition, Penn Cove is the only non-reservation honored with hosting the canoe races.
Canoes are still a cultural way of life. We have war canoes that we race, and we have a scheduled circuit that we follow that goes from Mother's Day to Labor Day, and we race every weekend, so we have to practice for that. So that's still a part of our culture and a way of life, because we do it every day. So these are 11-man canoes. It takes 11 people, We have several categories of canoes. So the 50-foot canoes are 11, the 40-foot canoes are 6 man, and then we have the 26-foot canoes are doubles, and the 20-foot canoes are singles.
The primary racing canoes are 50-foot, 11-person canoes and are raced by men and women. There are also other smaller categories of canoes. Youth paddlers also compete in their own racing classes. There is a history about why they are called war canoes.
There's a history of war canoes. They were actually used for war, and the Cowichan people would use long, slim canoes for raids. So they would come in, and they're very stealth-like. They're quiet, and you can sneak up on somebody. So these canoes were used for war. And the paddle that they had wasn't a paddle. They actually called it a club. So that was their weapon. So they used it to travel, but when they landed, they used it for fighting. So that was the history and the story that I had gotten from some elders that I talked to, and why it was called war canoe racing.
1989 heralded a significant change. The first paddle to Seattle canoe journey helped shift natives back into the mindfulness and culture of traditional canoe making and paddling.
I started the canoe journey in 1989, the paddle to Seattle. It was the Washington State Centennial. They wanted to include the natives in on the celebration, and the tribal leaders got together and discussed what we wanted to do. And we had talked about for years getting our canoe family ways, reviving them again, bringing them back. And this was the opportunity to do that.
The goal was to promote tribal pride and zero tolerance for drugs and alcohol. The canoe tradition continues and has had great success in restoring cultural traditions and community pride.
I guess in a nutshell, one tribe agrees to host, and we get in a canoe and we travel to that destination. And we do this to remind our kids of who we are as Native people and where we come from.
The development of canoe design and construction continues. Modern canoes are made of strong, lightweight cedar laminate or other modern materials. The traditional dugout construction grows increasingly rare, especially for larger canoes because of a limited supply of larger old-growth cedar trees. While new canoes are still being constructed, a few old canoes have survived and are being honored by being restored. One of the oldest surviving canoes, the Snakeolum canoe, is over 150 years old and is one of the oldest examples of a Coast Salish family canoe. This canoe was left out in the elements at the Island County Museum until 2012, when a restoration project was initiated with partial funding by the Swinomish Indian tribal community and Tulalip tribes. As a connection with the past and to tell its story as part of the canoe culture of Penn Cove and the Salish Sea.